The gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm listening very intently, and I'm finding a lot of interesting connotations in the conversation. It sounds like, in the interest of trying to move forward this legislation to provide funding for affordable housing, there's a resistance or a hesitation to do so if we don't pursue deregulation perhaps first. And I think that deregulating makes sense to a certain extent, but I don't think we should be abdicating our responsibilities to address the affordable housing crisis in this country. We shouldn't be abdicating that responsibility to localities which we do not have any jurisdictions over. I think that maybe perhaps in our role we can influence our respective districts to address whatever is holding back the development opportunities in the regulatory framework, but I think that we need to stay focused on what our duties are here and now with respect to this particular piece of legislation. And in the context of that, I wanted to talk about how we're looking at, I think, two different arenas here, really, and we're comparing them in ways that I don't think are very accurate, at least not an accurate reflection of what we're dealing with in those two particular areas. Mr. Carter, you basically, your interest in the whole affordable housing arena is focused on private capital and utilizing private capital to address the public housing issues in this country. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in the earlier conversation, it was talked about how your target range is about 7,000 to 20,000 as a cost basis when it comes to rehabbing existing structures for affordable housing purposes.
Yes, sir.
And it was also mentioned in that conversation that the $55,000 per unit cost that's going to be addressed in this particular legislation is, well, it was intimated that it was higher than what your costs are, but the whole purpose of your operation is to pursue those kind of projects that have the least amount of cost and the highest rate of return. Is that correct?
I would say that those that have the appropriate risk-adjusted return, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Ms. Hodman, you represent the agencies.
That's correct.
And this $55,000 per unit public housing cost is to address the agency concern. Ms. Yentl, you spoke about how the agency rehabilitation issues have been underfunded for decades.
Yes.
And it's been cut off by as much as 50% over the last almost 20 years.
That's right.
Now, I think that we can get the private sector and the public sector to agree that when you defer maintenance for that long, the cost to rehab those units increases exponentially over time. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can we get a consensus across the board on that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the underinvestment over all these decades is, I would argue, a large cost component of why we're talking about $55,000 per unit today, as opposed to $7,000 or $20,000 per unit for a private firm that's able to go out and almost pick and choose what projects to undertake. Is that correct?
That is correct,
Yes.
sir.
Do we have consensus on that across the board?
I would simply say that we may be comparing apples and oranges in that case, because I think the level of capital needs and the level of deferment of the deferral of maintenance in some of the public housing portfolio would be much greater than that which Mr. Carter, than a property that Mr. Carter might be buying.
So I'm glad we're able to get that on the record, because I don't want us to, I think we're all on the same page here. I think that we definitely need to support and deregulate to allow for the private investment to continue to help meet those demands, so that we don't have to invest public money in the areas where the private investment isn't going to flow towards. I think that we just both have to figure out how to find that happy yin and yang here. I did want to talk about something that was mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Sherman, about rents are too damn high and wages are too damn low. And I think that, of course, that formula factors into the equation when it comes down to affordable housing. Ms. Yentl, you mentioned a single person with a disability relying on an annual income of just over $10,000 from supplemental security income is an example of inadequate income to meet housing needs. Is that correct?
Well, it's an example of an extremely low-income household, and they are the households who have the most severe shortages of homes affordable and available to them, yes.
Right. And so I wanted to just kind of reference that when I make this point here, and that is that while I know that your purposes are to advocate for housing in particular, I think that because we just have so much crossover here in the need for housing and the need for incomes that can afford that housing, I would ask that your organizations begin exploring the availability of their testimony to actually speak towards the income issues in this community. And one of them in particular, and I'll end with this, is that Guam as a territory does not get SSI. we don't even have that $10,000. And I just wanted to close by asking across the board, your organizations are all national organizations. Does that include territorial data?
Yes.
NARA does, yes.
Where the data is available, yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yield back.